welcome everyone. I suspect we'll have a few more people joining us, but I think we want to get started just so we can get the most out of our hour together. Great to see you all here to our session today in the RISE-UPP NASH monthly webinar series, leveraging an inclusive professional framework, reimagining personal and organizational transformation. Really appreciate you being with us. My name is Robin Greenler. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I co-lead along with Don, the NSF Eddie Bernice Johnson Includes Aspire Alliance. And the work that comes out of this comes from that Aspire Alliance, and we're really excited to have you here. Don, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi folks, Don Gillian Daniel, he, him pronouns, and in addition to working in Aspire with Robin, I'm also a Director of Professional Development in our Office of Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity in Engineering in our College of Engineering here at UW-Madison. And as Robin said, we're really excited to be with you today.
And for those of you who have just joined, we'll put in the chat a link to a handout for today's session. And if you could please download that, as you click on it, it'll prompt you to make a copy so that you'll have a copy, your own copy for today's session. Next slide. So the work that we're going to be talking about today is work from a large number of people from across institutions across the country. And we just wanted to briefly acknowledge some of the people whose intellectual input has been part of this project. Just give a shout out there. So today in our session, what we're really excited to share with you is the center of today's session is going to be this Aspire's Inclusive Professional Framework. We sometimes refer to it as the IPF. This inclusive professional framework is a model that will help us explore ways that you can advance the DEI work you're doing both individually and organizationally. And we're going to really spend some time looking at that framework and thinking about how you might apply that. We'll be taking a couple specific examples and walking you through a couple of examples experientially so that you have a sense of how it might be used and get a kind of a slice of what the larger model, where you might take it and what you might do with that. So those are our three outcomes for today. The first one, exploring the IPF, is really the heart of it. And then we'll, as I say, we'll be reflecting on one piece of that model in thinking about how it informs your DEI work and how you might use that to think about next steps for the change you want to see. I'm going to pass it to you, Don.
Thanks. And just to sort of locate the work that we're doing in the context of the Aspire Alliance. Aspire is focused on diversifying STEM faculty at a national level. There are three core initiatives within Aspire. The Institutional Change Initiative focuses on leading campuses through a 3-year organizational change process. The Regional Change Initiative looks at building connections between 2- and 4-year institutions and a regional R1 institution to build the pipeline of STEM faculty from the R1 into those campuses. And then the National Change Initiative, which Robin and I co-lead, we focus on the professional development aspect of broadening participation for STEM faculty, and the Inclusive Professional Framework, which we'll tell you about in just a moment, is the foundation of the work that we do. Because our work is typically done in a workshop setting, we're going to give you a taste of that today. And so we're going to lift up for you some of the things that we do to create the space to have the conversations that we have. We'll share with you, as Robin was saying, a little bit more about the framework and how we think about that at both individual and organizational levels. And then we will give you an opportunity to think about your roles on your campus as you work to advance DEI agendas locally. Now, the framework can help you think about that work. We'll typically start a workshop with a community compact like this, and this one is adapted from an article by Özlem Sensoy and Robin DeAngelo, and it allows us to really focus on creating a space for doing this work together. One of the things that we'll do today is ask you to reflect on your own social and cultural identities and other factors that afford you privilege in an academic space. And so in the context of that type of work, one of the things we're asking you to think about is when those feelings come up inside as you're saying, gee, this isn't really the most comfortable conversation to be having, we're inviting you to lean into that space, whether it's with us today or in other settings, because we really think that discomfort as we have these types of conversations is where the growth happens. And one of the things that we aim to do through our work is really normalize these types of conversations so that individuals are more equity focused as they navigate their different spaces on campus, whether it's in a classroom with students, in a faculty meeting, whether they're leading as a department chair or as an administrator leading those types of initiatives on their campus. So we're inviting you to hold this community compact with us and really think about your openness to the ideas that we're going to share. In the handout, Robin, if you could drop in, okay, the handout, Rohit, thank you for putting that in. The link to the handout is in the chat. In the handout are a list of key definitions that frame the type of conversation that we want to have in this space. And I'm going to lift up a couple because they'll be relevant to the conversation we're having. The first one, when we talk about social identities, we're talking about the types of social categories that people would ascribe to you. So when you walk into the room, there are categories or bins that they put you in based on the social norms. And so in US society, particular social categories, like for me presenting as white and male, those are social categories that afford me privilege in the context in which I get to operate professionally. And those are not earned privileges. They come because of the social structures we have set up in US society. So we're going to ask you to think about the social and cultural identities that you hold and how those come into play in the DEI work you do on your campus. Layered onto that, then, different social identities confer different levels of power in academic settings. In addition to the social and cultural identities you hold, where you are in the academic hierarchy also will afford you power. And so in one space, you may have power as the instructor in front of a classroom of students. When you walk into a faculty meeting, if you're not the department chair, that power dynamic may shift and you may hold less power and influence in that space than you did in the classroom with students. Positionality speaks to that relative relationship between how we enter a space and other folks in that space based on the social and cultural identities they hold, other factors that speak to their background and experiences, and the power they hold within that academic hierarchy. And so we'll be talking about how these ideas come together to really influence the DEI work that we get to do on our campuses. All right. So let's set the stage a little bit more for you. In the work that we do, we think about systems change and how to best affect systems change. I like this image. It comes from a report by Kanai, Kramer, and Senge, and it outlines 6 conditions of systems change. And at that top level are the structural changes that we all think about when we are in conversation. And these are the ones that come up most frequently. And so if there's an issue on campus, oftentimes people will talk about what policies need to be changed, what programs need to be put in place, or how resources need to be allocated differently in order to address that challenge. The work that we do wants to get you thinking at the levels below that. So any of those programming, policy, or resource flow decisions really rely on the types of relationships that individuals have and the power dynamics of those relationships. That informs who gets invited to the conversation, that informs who has a voice in that conversation, and how those decisions get made. Below that then sit the mental models that we all hold. And these are the biases and assumptions that we all walk into these spaces carrying. Our institutions and our institutional cultures also hold different types of biases and assumptions about who can be successful in particular disciplines, what that success looks like going forward, and how it ought to be rewarded. The work that we do really aims to look at those mental models, because if we can start to raise up and be aware of those biases and assumptions that we hold that are just built in and baked into the systems that we operate in, we can think about those relationships and power dynamics differently, so that when it comes down to making decisions about programming or policy or resource allocation, we can be thinking about that differently as well, with more of an equity mindset. The Aspire Alliance created the Inclusive Professional Framework. The framework is really designed to help us think about how to build that equity mindset so that we can really start to poke at those mental models and do this work differently. The framework is based on the idea that there are a set of awareness, knowledge, and skills that are common across the various roles that folks hold on campus. The image here on the slide and at the bottom of the second page of your handout is the Inclusive Professional Framework for faculty. The framework is based on the idea that if you have a deeper awareness of your own and others' social and cultural identities, and the backgrounds and experiences that come with those social and cultural identities, if you have skills to navigate intercultural differences effectively, you can deepen the equity mindset that you have. You then take that equity mindset and put it into practice in the way that you build relationships with others and the way that you communicate with others. The strength of the model for us is that when you look at competencies across different faculty roles, competencies in inclusive teaching, advising, mentoring, and research, for example, common across all of those competencies is a need to have that understanding of identity, intercultural awareness, and how you communicate and build relationships. So the idea behind the framework is, if you as an administrator, if you as a faculty member build, or as an institutional instructor or staff member build skills in thinking differently about your own and others' social and cultural identities, if you build skills to navigate differences effectively, and you integrate that into how you communicate with others and build relationships, you can apply that in the teaching that you do, the advising of students that you do, mentoring of students in research spaces, and those are all student-focused, as well as your peer and institution-focused roles like being an effective colleague or a good colleague and an effective leader. So when we think about using the Inclusive Professional Framework, what we're really doing is trying to help folks shift mindset so that they can start to lift up those mental models, the biases and assumptions they hold, so that they think about building interpersonal relationships differently and ultimately making those policy, programming, and resource decisions differently. Robin, what am I not remembering to communicate that we should talk about here?
I think that's good. I think we can keep moving.
So I'm going to just pause, folks, because this is really central to the work that we're doing, and we want to lay it as a foundation for our conversation today. Do you have any questions that you would like to share? Simplest is probably to just drop them into the chat, and then we can lift them up for conversation. Any questions or clarifications you would like before we move into how we can apply using this in the work that we do on our campuses? All right, Robin, I'll assume that somebody is typing and that you can start, and we'll lift it up before we send them off to do the next bit. There is a question from Brianna. The question is about why mental models and why not also emotional, energetic, physical, and or spiritual. I think my answer to that would be simply that they're kind of all wrapped together, but when we think about bias, when we think about assumptions that we hold, that oftentimes falls into that academic space that we occupy. And so we can talk about, well, the literature says this, or we've had experiences like this, and we're going to generalize them here. And at least I found in the academic spaces that we occupy, you don't often have an opportunity to talk about things like emotional intelligence and how those play into those spaces. And I see that you're making a similar comment, but I do agree with you that those are important to consider.
And I think it would be a really interesting conversation to think about how our mental models interact with some of those other models. How is it that we hold the whole container of what builds our assumptions and our blind spots and our kind of worldview, and what parts of those, how do they interact? I think that'd be a really interesting conversation. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective up, Brianna. So if you think about this inclusive professional framework, it often makes a kind of intuitive sense to people, but they say, that's a fine, we get feedback, that's a fine framework, but how would I apply that? What would I do with that? On the right is a action planning process that we use when we're helping people think through some DEI related change that they want to make at their institution. It's probably fairly familiar to all of you. You've seen versions of this. And the question is, how do you apply, if I'm going to make this change at my institution, what do I do with things like mental models or identity and intercultural views, relational, how does that translate into organizational change? And what we're going to do today is just take one piece, looking just at the example of identity, and then kind of map it onto one part of an action planning process. And in this case, stakeholder mapping. Who is it that you want to reach with your DEI change? Who is it who could be support for you or resources for you, or might be challenges or roadblocks? What is the people context that you're looking at, and especially who is it that you're trying to reach? How might some looking at things with the perspective of identity help you shake loose what you've been doing with that and think about it in a slightly different way? We're hoping to walk you through that small piece, but then you can see that there's lots of other ways you could map onto different parts of the action planning process or to different parts of the framework. So let's step into the identity exploration. This identity, we call it an identity wheel, academic wheel of privilege, is something that many of you have probably seen in one version or another. I particularly like this one because it's made thinking about an academic environment, and it has around the outer circle are lists of various kinds of identities. Some of these are visible, and some of these are invisible. And an identity itself doesn't necessarily convey privilege one way or another. It really has to do with the context it's in. And in the context of the United States and the context of academia, these identities have different forms that they take that convey more privilege or less. And so in this graphic, as you move towards the center of the wheel, those aspects of identity are ones that generally can carry more privilege. Now there's certainly some other identities that could be added onto this, but it gives some examples of some of the social and cultural identities that are assigned to us by society and that are then put into a context that we're socialized to respond to one another in various ways, to react. It affects the assumptions, understandings, and both for those that are visible and for those that are invisible in terms of what we carry and what we're assuming. So one of the things we'd like to do is have you take some time and think about where you sit on this identity wheel. Something we're not going to do today, but I might encourage you to think about doing, is to think about where is it with each of these different identity descriptors, where is that you sit, and just actually make an X on your graphic. This is something not for today, but another time you might do. And as you put all of those in, it gives you a composite view of where is it that I'm sitting relative to kind of privilege, relative to these various identities. Today, what we'd like to do is first just give you a little bit of time to reflect yourself. So take about 5 minutes to just think about the various identities that you carry and how those play out in various contexts. Because what a certain identity, what kind of privilege it conveys. This one is looking at an academic, but even within the academic context, your identities might play out very differently if you're in a department meeting versus if you're in the classroom. So what identities do you, for instance, as an instructor or as a leader or as a faculty member, what kinds of identities do you bring into and are you most aware of when you walk into various contexts? Are there some identities that are more ubiquitous and much more present for you in some contexts, and others that you're more likely to hide? Are there some that are more fluid? So just to kind of think about how those identities of yours play differently in different parts of your professional life. So I think on the next slide, yep, the two reflection prompts, and we're going to give you about 5 minutes to just reflect on this in the worksheet that you've downloaded. What social and cultural identities, other factors are most salient or relevant for you when you're engaged in DEI work on your campus? And how does, if at all, does your awareness of these identities impact your DEI work? So take about 5 minutes just to jot down some thoughts on that. And then and feel free to turn off your camera if you'd like, and we'll bring you back in about 5 minutes. Don, anything you want to add?
Nope, thank you.
Okay. And if you don't have any questions or can't find the handout, just put them in the chat and we'll put that link up again. So we'll give you just another 15 seconds or so to kind of wrap up some of your thoughts, and then we'll join back together here. Okay, if we could have your attention back here for a minute, what we'd like to do is invite you to go to the shared Google Doc that's in that Don just put into the chat. And if you go in there, if you would like to go in anonymously, you'll need to sign out of your Google Docs and go in anonymously if you wish. But go there, and if you would be willing to just write down some feedback, thought you have about that second prompt, which is how, if at all, does your awareness of your social identities, power, and positionality impact your DEI work? So pull out a thought or two that you had and that you'd be willing to share with the rest of the group, and let's see what kinds of group reflection we have here.
Folks, if you've finished typing, we invite you to just read what others are writing. We'll come back and debrief together in just a minute.
Thank you for all the sharing. And there's some really interesting things here. I'm seeing actually an interesting split where some people feel like they're most aware of the fact that their identities that are most privileged. That people are saying, as a white cis male, I'm very aware of that, and I then navigate relationships, or what I say, how I speak, how I present in a space based on being aware of that position of privilege in this culture. For other people, they're saying, I'm most aware of the identities where I'm less privileged. And I think both of those are really valid and interesting to reflect on. It's also interesting to me to see that for a lot of you, the issue is both how do I use my identity to leverage in a situation, to leverage the work I'm trying to do, to leverage to help support other students or other people, or help make space for other voices, or help create a context or a situation or a space that's safe. So there's this idea of, I have the privilege, so what can I do with it? How can I use it? How can I leverage it? Don, are there other things that you want to pick up from this thread, or other things that people would like to put into the chat that they're intrigued by?
I just want to mention, at least one person was mentioning both the visible and invisible identities that they hold. And I think that's an important point here. When you walk into the room, there are things that just come with you into that space. And given positionality, it really defines how you get to be in that space together with other people. And so I think the more awareness that we can bring into the conversations that we have, the spaces that we occupy around this, it's important to do that. And thinking about the things that you just can't hide, and why might you want to hide them because of what it might allow you to do differently in those spaces, are important things to think about.
Are there other things that people would like to lift up or reflect on from what they were reading? This is obviously just touching on kind of issues of social and cultural identity at the very surface, but it starts to move us into a place to say, as I think about my identity, then that makes me ask all sorts of questions or bring awareness to situations that I might not otherwise have had awareness of. And that the goal for us in terms of thinking about when we use the inclusive professional framework is that as we get more awareness of our own personal identities and our cultural context, it allows us to develop an equity mindset. So kind of a lens that then we can use to interrogate almost everything we do. When you build a syllabus, when you are thinking about what activities how do you want to teach in your classroom? What kind of pedagogy do you want to bring to it? How do you want to run a meeting, as a department chair? Or how do you want to show up in a meeting as a department chair? Or how do you want to show up with a colleague who perhaps you felt like was just ignored or had some kind of microaggression done to her or him? How do you show up with that? And all of those by being continually aware of not only the most visible parts of your identity, but the various other parts of your identity, and how those intersect with the power and positionality that you carry, can help you make decisions about how do I want to navigate this relationship with a student that is in my office right now, and what are the visible identities or the cues that I'm doing? How might that be helping build a bridge, or how might that be building a wall with that student, or how could I use that to better build a bridge, or better hear what they're saying in a way that's different from what it might have meant for me, because their experience is coming from a different background. John, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, let's move us forward to the next set of prompts so that we can really start to apply this a little bit more deeply. So on page 5 of the handout, you'll find these prompts. What we'd like to do is to have you think about, what DEI change are you working to advance on your campus? It could be within the context of a classroom, it could be at a departmental level, or at an institutional level. The next thing we'd like you to think about is, who do you need to work with to make that change happen? Who are the stakeholders that you need to engage? It could be students in your classroom. It could be a chief academic officer or STEM deans. Who are those people that need to be part of the conversation? And then we'd like you to pick 1 to 2 key stakeholders, people that you need to engage with to make this change happen, and just spend a couple minutes thinking about those individuals and any identity-based assumptions you might be making about them. And so when we're thinking about this, we want you to be considering the identities that you hold, any of the assumptions you hold about these individuals, and how that comes into the work that you're doing together. Think about the dynamics of that interpersonal relationship. Are these individuals in the work because it is what they need to be doing? Are they in the work because they really want to be engaging in these issues and they are really looking to move the needle on campus? Is there an element of compliance to it? All of the different things that you are hoping to accomplish really start at the level of those interpersonal relationships and really build on how you come into that space together with other individuals. So what are you hoping to advance? Who do you need to engage to advance that work on your campus? And are there any assumptions that you make about who they are coming into that space and their interest and ability to move that work forward together with you? Take a couple minutes to reflect, and then we'll come back. We'll do a shared Google Doc again to get some ideas, and we will do some debriefing together. We'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes to think through this. So again, this is just getting you started with some thinking and applying the work of the Inclusive Professional Framework. Take about another minute, folks, to reflect individually. When you're done, Robin, drop the link to the shared Google Doc back into the chat, beginning on page 2. Again, is a prompt, and we'd like you to think about sharing out how, if at all, the identities that are most salient to you and the assumptions you hold about others impact the work that you do on your campus. Take about another minute or two with the shared Google Doc, and then we'll just come back together to debrief. Thanks, folks, for those who've commented in the Google Doc. Please feel free to continue to add in that space if ideas come up. I wanted to, Robin and I have been talking about how what we asked of you is a really challenging ask in the context of a webinar, in the context of a limited amount of time. And our goal really is to give you an opportunity to think about the work that you do a little bit differently. And my hope is that when you walk into a meeting with colleagues, that one of the things you do in that space is look at the room a little bit differently and think about who you are in the context of that space, what positional authority you do or don't have in that space, and how it allows you to navigate that space. Some of the comments here are about assumptions about colleagues and who is and is not interested in doing this work. And I think, at least based on the work that we've done with faculty, a lot of times what we hear is when stuff happens, if there are incidents of bias or microaggressions, faculty don't say stuff because they don't want to make things worse. And I think that generalizes more broadly, and oftentimes, because these tend to be uncomfortable conversations, we try not to have them. And a goal of the work that we do is really trying to provide spaces to normalize that it's okay to talk about this stuff, because it really does drive all of the work that we do, both in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also the other types of things, the other interpersonal relationships we work to navigate on our campuses. What we'd like to do is to stop with a few minutes remaining in the session and just ask, what are you sitting with? What questions are coming up for you? Feelings or thoughts in this space about what we've been sharing with you? And just open it up. You're welcome to drop it in the chat or video and microphone if you would like.
And it really can be anything from, the community compact we started with, the inclusive professional framework, the how do you map this into work you're doing, thinking about issues of identity, or comments, reflections.
While folks are thinking, I'm wondering if some of our Rise Up NASH colleagues had any thoughts about how the conversation today applies to the work that the Alliance is going to be doing together over the next couple of years. Not to put you on the spot, but.
Well, if nobody else is going to jump in, I will. I'm Rebecca Martin. I am the Executive Director of NASH, the National Association of System Heads, and I'm also leading the backbone for the Rise Up Alliance. And I think this is all critical because, as those of you that have been directly involved in Rise Up know, we are we're thinking very hard about climate, about readiness, about making sure that the experience that our postdocs have in the departments that they enter is a positive one. And I think all of these issues come into play when you think about those issues, those elements of the work. And so I really appreciate the intentionality of the framework and the way that you have brought these issues to the surface, because I know that they're going to be very important for all of us to be considering. And in fact, not just in the Rise Up work itself, but in the broader equity efforts that we are all engaged in across our systems.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Sure.
Sadiq has a question about HSI and HBCU campus context. So in terms of how the social and cultural context is different. And so we've worked with the HBCU Faculty Development Network in doing this work. And one of the things that I think is important about the framework is it really identifies some core things that apply across all of the types of institutional roles you have. All of the work that we do is relational. And whether it's at a PWI or an HBCU, it's all relational work. And when you walk into a room, your identities, your power and your positionality, they all come into play to define how you get to be in that space. And so I think independent of the context, the more we can together start to think about how all of these things come into play so that we can name them and set them aside so we can make decisions differently together. I think we would be doing our work together much differently if that were the case. If we could normalize talking about this kind of stuff so that we could say, you know, when I walk into this room as a non-administrator, I don't feel like I have the positionality to speak up because I don't feel like what I have to say gets valued in the same way. And what would the conversation be like if you could name that and then move forward with other people going, got it, let's see if we can shift that dynamic. Robin, I haven't been looking. Are there things in the chat that you want to lift up? There are a couple questions.
Yeah, I think Megan's question is a good one here. The question I grapple with is like, is that I can help change the mindset of numerous faculty on my campus as a role from her role in the CTL. But how do you impact the policies, practices, and resource flows if you're not interacting with the right stakeholders? Do you have advice and can explain where in the IPF model this concern fits in and what are the strategies to address this?
One of the things, and Robin, please jump in here. One of the things that we're aiming to do really is to think about who are the key leverage points on campuses. Aspire runs a summer institute, and we started bringing in faculty and realized that directors of centers for teaching and learning and STEM ed centers are better levers for change as our institutional administrators. And so I think while you work with the audience that you have access to, doing some mentoring up to others to start to shape that conversation is one way to start to bridge that gap that you're mentioning here. Robin, are there other things that you would to sort of better frame that?
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that we also run into is people saying that, you know, I work at that level of structural change, right, where resource flows and policies and practices. And so I don't really do this identity kind of work because I work really at an institutional level. But people will say that all the way down the road, right? I teach in STEM. I do physics, so I don't really need to do this identity stuff because I just teach the facts, right? And so part of it is at all these different levels is to kind of start to say, for all of us at whatever level, there are all sorts of base assumptions, blind spots, understandings that we have that are unique to our personal identity and cultural mindsets that impact how we make those decisions. And so when one of the things that we often do, and it's not exactly addressing your question, Megan, but to say at whatever level you're at, what are the parts what structural control and impact and agency do you have, whether it's how you organize your classroom or how you interact in your department or how you interact in your office, your CTL, and how can we continue to look both at the structural and the personal, how those interact together. It doesn't exactly address the what do you do if you don't have access to the level where you feel like decisions are being made. But I still think there's this idea that at all levels, there's some kinds of structural controls and there's some kinds of individual interaction with those controls.
I also think that it is work that gets done over time. Work that we did on our campus a number of years ago with faculty, getting them to think about equity and inclusion and teaching more inclusively. Those faculty are now the department chairs. They're moving into administrative roles on campus. And so they are making different decisions based on those types of experiences that they had, thinking differently about this work when they were faculty. And so there's also the long game to this. For our Rise Up NASH colleagues, we're coming up to the end of the session. We did want to share with folks that on the Aspire website, we do have some resources that we'd like to draw your attention to. And if I can talk and screen share at the same time, I'll share those with you. We have a guide to academic advising for STEM faculty, and we'll be releasing a quick start version of this. And we are defining academic advising as different from the mentoring that faculty do in a research space. At the end of your handout are a number of articles that we've published about the inclusive professional framework. And then if you're interested in learning more about this, and Robin, could you drop the link in the chat, please, from the session plan? On March 17th, we'll be running a longer workshop that digs into the inclusive professional framework. So if you or others on your campus might be interested, we invite you to take a look at that and consider joining us for that. And Robin will grab and drop that link in the chat. And then for our Rise Up NASH colleagues, is there anything else that you would like to say as we wrap up the session today?
Sure. This is Rebecca again. I would just like to thank Don and Robin for this wonderful session. I think that you've got us thinking about in lots of new directions, and that's really important. I want to thank all of the people who have come from many different places. We're really pleased that you found our posting interesting, and so we're bringing in people from well beyond the Rise Up network, which is just terrific. And I hope that you will all join us a month from now when we take a deep dive into one of the core model programs that we're utilizing in our alliance, which is from the University of California. So keep an eye open for that post, for that webinar registration if you haven't already seen it. And then finally, I'd like to let all of you know that we're very privileged to have Aspire serving as our mentor alliance. They've been in the NSF Includes Alliance network for a long time. We're just getting started and we're learning a lot from you. So thank you all very much. We appreciate your help and support.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to
Thank
be
you,
with folks
Rebecca.
today.
Thank you all for coming.